It wasn't that long ago that the Republicans filibustered the For the People Act because of course they were gonna do that. They filibustered the bipartisan bill, bipartisan in that both Democrats and Republicans out there across America support it. You just can't get a single Republican senator to support it. So what's gonna happen? Well, Joe Biden is responding by meeting with advisors and experts, figuring out their next step. They put out a statement from the White House saying the president and his staff highlighted ways that the administration will continue working with Congress to pass critical legislation and ramp up engagement with the American people on voting rights. The president also reiterated his unwavering determination to win the fight to protect the sacred right to vote in free and fair elections. He said that he would speak more on the issue this week. That's what he said when it was filibustered, though it's unclear when that's gonna happen. He has said, I'm gonna be going around the country making the case to the American people that this isn't just about showing identification or being able to give someone water in line. This is about who is able to judge whether your vote gets counted. But as of right now, and I understand he is starting to travel. Supposedly, I believe he's gonna go to Miami. He might do some other trips too, we'll see. Maybe he'll talk about it there. But so far, the response to the filibuster of one of the core pieces of his first term agenda has been super muted. And in response, a lot of activists and progressive politicians have an issue with it. Cliff Albright, who's one of the co-founders of Black Voters Matter, said they're checking the boxes. They're not acting like we're facing an existential crisis. That's the problem. It's from the top down. And Charles, yeah, so far, I mean, I get that they're not gonna seem super shocked by the filibuster, but they don't seem that aggrieved by it either. It seems like, yeah, okay, maybe we'll get around to it at some point.
You know, John, I tend to agree, and I think that the administration is making a very, very bad miscalculation on how much their sort of, I don't want to call it ineptitude, but their unwillingness to really go hard around this filibuster, even as it may have been expected, is going to play with some of the base that they need to turn out both for midterms and then for the larger presidential election. I think that they're taking for granted that they're going to be able to just point to Republicans and say, it's their fault, that's why it didn't get done. I mean, we've seen now Merrick Garland and the DOJ get involved in terms of litigating some of this on the court front. I think that was the smart thing to do. But I also think that the case in terms of going around the country, the narrative has to be framed properly, because even for him to say this is not about IDs, this is about who gets to judge, who gets to participate in democracy. Let's break down that statement first and foremost. The latter part of it, when you're talking about who gets to judge about participating in democracy, is a direct allusion to white nationalism, because it's about the decision around who has access to our processes, who is the civic process of America supposed to work for, and who can participate in that. That is at the core of white nationalist ideology. Call it what it is. Like, be courageous enough to call it what it is. The first part, this is not about IDs, is really a dangerous sort of playing into, I think, GOP narratives and conservative narratives around the ease at which, or the perceived ease at which, people can access the democratic process. People take for granted, especially if you live in a metropolitan area, that these things are not necessarily as inconvenient as other places. If you live in Alabama, for example, there are parts of Alabama where it's 50 miles to the nearest DMV from anyone's house. They don't have an extensive public transportation system, and many people who are residents actually survive on public assistance with state issued IDs. So what happens when those people who work every single day, who already have a state issued ID, are told that their state issued ID that they have on public assistance is no longer good to allow them to vote? They go to work Monday through Friday, the DMV, which is 50 miles away, and they don't drive, is the only place that they can go to get a proper ID. I think framing it in those terms makes people sort of understand, wow, this is a real issue. As opposed to someone who lives in a city, I live in New York, I can take a bus or a train or walk or take an Uber to the DMV, and I'm there in less than 20 minutes. So I think some of us take for granted that when you talk about or dismiss the notion that, oh, well, this just isn't about ID, so on and so forth, you're already allowing them to frame the narrative in a way that misconstrues it so that the American public doesn't understand the severity of this problem. And secondly, again, you have to be able to call it what it is. This is white nationalism at its core. But in total, John, I really think that if he is not much more vocal and aggressive about calling out the forces that are pushing against this in a real way, that whole notion of, well, we tried, Republicans stopped it, is not gonna be enough for voters.
Yeah, and it shouldn't be. Right. After all they did in the last election. Yeah, so I wanna ask you a couple quick follow-ups about some stuff we've been talking about. So one is I've seen an attempt to push back specifically against, you just described how in some areas this identification is relatively easy to get, in some it's much more difficult. The Republican response, I don't remember if it was Ted Cruz or Rick Santorum or whoever, they're all basically the same human. They said the idea that only one race has a hard time getting identification is by definition racist. So if you express a concern that some people might be disproportionately inconvenienced by this, that is a racist statement. Is there anything to that?
No. I mean, that's my short answer. And I think the overarching idea is let's just for a moment, let's just imagine that we are going to accept that statement, at least part of that statement, as being valid, i.e. that it's not just one group that has a problem getting ID. This doesn't disproportionately affect any particular race. It affects us all, or it affects a number of different people who have difficulty getting ID. Well, in the wake of not having actual evidence of voter fraud or widespread voter fraud, which we have been waiting for literally for years now, since President Obama was running for office, these unfounded claims of voter ID in widespread instances have never ever been substantiated, right? So in the absence of that, why are you making it more difficult for anyone of any race to be able to participate in American democracy? Yeah. So even if I accept what you're saying is true, which I do not for a number of reasons, but even if I accept what you're saying as being true, your overall conclusion is faulty, because you're just basically saying, I'm still okay with this being a harder process for people to access because it's harder for everybody, despite the fact that it's a fundamental tenet of our American democracy. Now, picking apart the actual nuance within the statement, it's also not true, because if you look at the places where there are voter ID laws and are voter ID restrictions, and the places that are disproportionately affected, they are overwhelmingly filled with people of color. They are overwhelmingly Black and brown people. So the statement itself from a factual place is false. And there are a number of structural inequities which further contribute to how, when properly contextualized, it's nonsensical. So yeah, the answer, it's a no all around. And even if it were a yes, why would you want to make it harder for people to vote when there's no evidence that the widespread voter fraud that you're claiming to guard against even exists?
Yeah. Well, I mean, we know why.
Well, right, of course.
Yeah.
Check out the Damage Report podcast each day, wherever you get your podcasts, whether Pocket Casts or Stitcher or iTunes. You can join me as I give you the news and stories you want, with a range of co-hosts and interview guests jumping in on the fun each day. Again, that's the Damage Report, wherever you get your podcasts. And if you get them at iTunes, don't forget to rate and review. Sometimes I'll read them live on the show.